So today I'd like to examine Kurzgesagt's recent video, Is Civilization on the Brink of Collapse? For those of you who are interested in understanding the full scope of the criticism I'm going to present today, I would recommend that you watch Kurzgesagt's video in whole before watching this one. I have linked it in the description down below if you do want to check it out. With that said, for a video entitled, Is Civilization on the Brink of Collapse? It fails to even remotely touch on this particular question. Instead, the video describes a very hopeful view of how humanity can survive collapse when it inevitably happens. This is done by comparing a collapse of the modern global civilization produced under neoliberalism to the collapse of prior civilizations, in a way that misrepresents history, is presented in a Eurocentric way, and ignores or completely misunderstands the way that modern society is likely to collapse. Further, while I do believe that if Earth remains even remotely hospitable to human life, that we do have a chance to survive as a species, I believe that the video disregards the reality of who will survive such a devastating collapse and makes potentially dangerous assumptions about how a society would reform after total collapse occurs. So to start with, the video provides an extremely brief examination of some of the perceived positive aspects of Roman civilization, including things like upward mobility, before describing how the once stable civilization suddenly and slowly collapsed. It then defines civilization in the following way.
By civilization, we mean a complex society where labor is specialized and social classes emerge and which is ruled by institutions. Civilizations share a dominant mutual language and culture and domesticate plants and animals to feed and sustain large cities where they often construct impressive monuments.
While this definition may seem very textbook, it actually does not properly represent one key aspect of many early civilizations, namely that many were not hierarchical at all. Recent archaeological and anthropological evidence seems to indicate that the Indus Valley Civilization, early Mesopotamia, and parts of Mesoamerica were actually not hierarchical. This is significant because there's also evidence to show that civilizations that did not display hierarchical and despotic traditions were far less prone to disintegration of social formations. We can see this in the article Killing the Priest King, Addressing Egalitarianism in the Indus Civilization by Adam S. Green of Cambridge University. In the introduction to his paper, he writes, "Far from being restricted to political economies rife with hierarchy and coercion, trade has commonly occurred in contexts where a ruling class is absent. Indeed, standardized systems of weights and measures, clear evidence of people attempting to develop commensurate quantities of goods, have been recovered in contexts that lack significant wealth differentiation." Later on in the same text, he states, "While there are certainly examples of complex societies where despotic kings made bombastic claims to power and authority, there are at least as many instances of early states that cycle through periods of centralization and disintegration, or where formal political hierarchies were fragile and unstable. Many societies, moreover, tended to favor cooperative and representative forms of governance. Understanding how different political and economic formations emerge and disintegrate is an ongoing project, but it would appear that political coercion carries with it a range of higher costs and may make social formations more prone to disintegration, while cooperation avoids some of those costs. A collective state based on cooperation may in fact require no coercion and therefore lack a ruling class to do coercing." This is a significant oversight in the premise of the video, especially when we're examining collapse in a global society where economic inequality is rampant and hierarchical institutions run society based on their own interests. This information introduces an interesting question that is never even examined within the video. Namely, could a cooperative model of society, one that differs from our capitalist neoliberal system, be developed that makes us less prone to such a collapse? Instead, the video infers that our current model is inevitable even in future civilizations. Now, getting back to the video for a moment, it now spends time asking the question about whether or not, just like Rome's technology was lost to medieval Europe, if our modern technology may be lost to a future civilization, before asserting a bunch of positives about our current global society, while naturally glossing over the lack of access that many people face globally to these very same perks and benefits. To the video's credit, however, it does acknowledge that we have yet to achieve any of this without destroying our ecosphere. Then, in a strange twist of logic, we find this segment of the video.
A collapse of the industrialized world literally means that the majority of people alive today would perish, since without industrial agriculture, we would no longer be able to feed them. And there's an even greater risk. What if a collapse was so deeply destructive that we were unable to reindustrialize again? What if it ruined our chances of enjoying a flourishing future as a multiplanetary species?
Yes, because the deepest concern in regard to the majority of the planet dying is whether or not we get to colonize other worlds as if we have an interstellar manifest destiny project on our hands. I'm far less concerned with re-industrializing after collapse, and far more concerned with preserving as much life as possible after collapse happens, and addressing which populations will survive said collapse.
How likely is all of this? Let's start with some good news. While civilization collapses have happened regularly, none have ever derailed the course of global civilization. Rome collapsed, but the Aksumite Empire, or the Teotihuacans, and of course the Byzantine Empire, carried on.
Don't worry, everyone. Despite all these horrific possibilities and outcomes, there's good news. We've never seen a total collapse of civilization before. People always survive in some other part of the globe. Somehow, we went from acknowledging the difference and interconnectedness of our current global reality and recognizing that a full collapse of this current civilization could mean the majority of people dying, and now we're just going to be fine somehow because it's never happened historically this particular way? This is a very odd and contradictory direction for this video to go.
So far, we've not seen a catastrophe that has killed much more than 10% of the global population. No pandemic, no natural disaster, no war. The last clear example of a rapid global population decrease was the Black Death, a pandemic of the bubonic plague in the 14th century that spread across the Middle East and Europe and killed a third of all Europeans and about 1/10 of the global population. If any event was going to cause the collapse of civilization, that should have been it.
And right here is where we can very obviously identify the Eurocentrism of this video. First of all, why would the bubonic plague cause the collapse of civilization in totality when the Eastern and Western hemispheres had no contact at this point in history? Additionally, the last major catastrophe in which we saw a 10% decline in the Earth's population was not the bubonic plague. It was the rampant destruction through disease and conquest of the Americas. We know that our new data-driven best estimate is a death toll of 56 million by the beginning of the 1600s, 90% of the pre-Columbian indigenous population, and around 10% of the global population at the time. This makes the Great Dying the largest human mortality event in proportion to the global population, putting it second in absolute terms only to World War II, in which 80 million people died, 3% of the world's population at that time. A figure of 90% mortality in post-contact America is extraordinary and exceeds similar epidemics, including the Black Death in Europe, which resulted in a 30% population loss in Europe. One explanation is that multiple waves of epidemics hit indigenous immune systems that had evolved in isolation from Eurasian and African populations for 13,000 years. Native Americans at that time had never been in contact with the pathogens the colonists brought, creating so-called virgin soil epidemics. People who didn't die from smallpox died from the following wave of influenza. Those who survived that succumbed to measles. Warfare, famine, and colonial atrocities did the rest of the Great Dying. The Great Dying, of course, was followed by centuries of slavery, further conquest, and the extraction of wealth and resources from the Americas and later Africa and Asia to fuel Europe's technological development into the Industrial Revolution. The video conveniently ignores these points and realities as if somehow the whole globe has managed to share in the bounty of the wealth and resources extracted from burning enough coal to destroy our ecosphere. Which should raise an important question in people's minds about today's potential collapse. Who will be the people that will face the full extent, and which civilizations will be destroyed first within our neoliberal order? Well, even the United Nations is able to acknowledge that it will be the third world who will suffer the greatest from climate catastrophe. According to the United Nations, climate change is likely to increase the prevalence of vector-borne diseases such as malaria and dengue fever, and may increase the intensity of severe weather events. It is likely to lead to an increase in water levels and serious flooding, and at the same time cause water scarcity in arid regions. Climate change is expected to irreversibly damage some natural resources and ecosystems. Overall, climate change is projected to deliver a devastating combination of adverse impacts for the world's poor, both because of geography and low income, making adaptation to climate change much more difficult. While developing countries have contributed the least to the problem, they are expected to bear the brunt of the impact of climate change, which threatens to jeopardize many of the developmental gains that have already been achieved. If collapse does happen, it will likely be the first world that will see the greatest survival rates, where they will continue to turn away climate refugees from the third world. Despite the happy picture that the video is attempting to paint of our species' survival, it is irresponsible at best to not identify this reality and identify which civilizations will be the ones that will be destroyed upon collapse. Now, as we return to the video, we find a bit of a strange comparison made, where the hopeful nature of the video describes the recovery of Hiroshima as an example of survival of collapse.
Take the atomic bombing of Hiroshima during World War II. 140,000 people were killed, and 90% of the city was at least partially incinerated or reduced to rubble. But against all odds, they made a remarkable recovery. Hiroshima's population recovered within a decade, and today it's a thriving city of 1.2 million people.
The video discusses this as if Hiroshima just recovered in a vacuum. Hiroshima had a massive amount of infrastructural support from neighboring cities in Japan. Hiroshima had water pumps restored in 4 days and full power to the surviving houses within 4 months in an incredible relief effort by volunteers. If we're comparing this to a total collapse of global civilization, there will be no equivalent infrastructural support available to provide this relief. The video admitted as much earlier on when describing a world in which the majority of the world's population perished, so why pretend that these are comparable now? The video then goes on to describe how nuclear catastrophe and biologically engineered viruses could wipe us out, while somehow ignoring the climate as an option, despite alluding to it only a few minutes prior.
Today's nuclear arsenals are so powerful that all-out global war could cause a nuclear winter and billions of deaths. Our knowledge of our own biology and how to manipulate it is getting so advanced that it's becoming possible to engineer viruses as contagious as the coronavirus and as deadly as Ebola. Increasingly, the risk of global pandemics is much higher than in the past. So we may cause a collapse ourselves, and it might be much worse than the things nature has thrown at us so far.
Next, the video tries to provide evidence for why we should be optimistic about recovery.
There are 1 billion agricultural workers today, so even if the global population fell to just 80 million, it's virtually guaranteed that many survivors would know how to produce food. And we don't need to start at square one, because we could still use modern high-yield crops.
Unfortunately, 800 million of those workers are poor agricultural workers from the third world, which, as I've mentioned, is likely to see the greatest effects of climate disaster and the largest decrease in population. This also ignores the fact that much of the Earth's surface may become inhospitable with time for growing crops. But don't worry, according to this video, we'll recover. It just may take a long time for us to get there.
We are thinking in larger timeframes. Industrialization originally happened 12,000 years after the agricultural revolution. So if we need to start over after a massive collapse, it shouldn't be that hard to reindustrialize, at least on evolutionary timescales. There's a hitch though. The Industrial Revolution was fueled literally by burning easily accessible coal, and we are still very much reliant on it. If we use it all up today, aside from making rapid climate change much worse, we could hinder our ability to recover from a huge crisis. So we should stop using easy-to-access coal so it can serve as a civilization insurance in case something bad happens.
In case something bad happens? You mean like climate change? This has to be the most bizarre argument yet. Somehow, they've made an optimistic video where the solution is to leave enough coal behind so the human species can reindustrialize after our society collapses, and thus pump even more carbon dioxide into the environment, completely missing the point of how we managed to collapse in the first place, so we can just repeat the cycle over and over and do it all over again. There's no questioning in this video of whether or not we should reindustrialize, if maybe we could reindustrialize differently, or perhaps if we could change the social structure of our global society to be one based more on cooperative models instead of competitive and hierarchical neoliberal ones. No. The solution is to save coal for the next time, completely ignoring the fact that we've nearly depleted all of the easily accessed fossil fuels and minerals already. The rest of the video makes the claim that because we already have knowledge, that it'll eventually be recovered in libraries, and thus everything will be fine. It then proceeds to summarize the video and then tries to market a book designed to tell you how you, as an individual, can do things to prevent the coming collapse without ever addressing the systemic factors involved. Instead of addressing the question that the video originally proposed, it has instead assumed a collapse and told us that despite the majority of people dying, we should put on a happy face because it won't be that bad, because humans can just rebuild using leftover coal that we leave them after we nuke ourselves or create a virus in a lab that kills us. All of this, of course, ignores the real threat of climate change, while also ignoring which populations have historically been and currently will be the most affected in such a collapse. Additionally, there are no real solutions here, like reorganizing society away from neoliberal capitalism and shutting down fossil fuel production in a model of degrowth. Instead, we're just told that we should march ever forward with the status quo, never changing the standard European model of industrializing ourselves into oblivion, repeatedly in an effort to manifest destiny our way into the stars. So with that said, if you've enjoyed what you've watched today, consider liking the video, subscribing, and leaving a comment, as well as joining my Discord where we have political conversations like these. If you're in a financial place to do so, and only if you're in a financial place to do so, please do consider supporting me on Patreon, especially as political content like this can often be demonetized on YouTube. The links for everything that I've mentioned are in the description down below. With that said, my name is Anarchist Tara. Thank you so much for watching.